Haley and I are doing another sewing showdown today. So in our last showdown, which we're going to link right here, we showed you two different ways to assemble bias tape. And today we're going to be talking about cutting bias tape. So how do you cut your bias tape? Do you do it in individual strips and then sew them together? Or do you do it in one continuous loop? We're each going to show you the way that we think is right. Whose method will be the best? You can cast your vote down below. So in this sew down, Haley's going to cut strips of bias tape and sew them together, and I am going to cut bias tape continuously. We're each going to explain the pros and cons of each approach, and you vote for the winner in the comments below. I hereby challenge you, Haley, to a bias tape duel. I accept. All right, so we're going to start making some continuous bias tape with a square. So we've got this 12 by 12 square, and the first thing we're going to do with it is cut it from one corner to the other corner. So if we were to fold it in half like this, you'd be cutting it right along that diagonal from one to the other. And you can do this with a pair of shears. You could just fold it like that. You could draw a line from one corner to the other and cut it with your shears, or you can use a rotary cutter like I'm going to do. So we're just going to cut it in half along this diagonal, just like that. And now we have two pieces, and what we're going to do is we're going to take these two pieces and we are going to sew them together along one edge to form a pair of little pants. So it's going to look like this. Something like that. Not exactly a pair of pants, kind of a little pair of pants. You can see the little legs here. So I'm going to pin this into place. You want to leave a little bit of a lap here at the end, and we're going to sew a 1/4 inch seam. And then we're going to sew a 1/4 inch seam along the top of the pants right there. All right, so we've sewn the top seam and I've pressed it open. So this is what it looks like now. Okay, so we are going to mark 1 inch strips, and you want to make sure when you do this, first of all, you do it on the wrong side of the fabric, and second of all, make sure you're doing it along the bias. So you can see we have stripes on this fabric, so you can see that this is the bias. That's what runs diagonally along the stripes. And if you're not sure, if you don't have a striped fabric and you can't see it, you can just kind of tug on it and you can see it stretches. That's the bias. So now we're ready to draw our lines. When you're drawing your lines, you might notice that you have one line that is kind of uneven at the end if you don't have like a full inch at the end. So you can either just ignore that or you can trim it off. Either way, I'm just going to trim it off just to make things a little bit easier to see. So just this little extra bit here. Okay. So the next step is we need to join this edge to this edge in order to create that continuous loop. So we'll turn it over to the right side, and we're going to fold this edge in, and then we're going to fold this edge in, and these stripes should start to line up. So you can see them lining up. And what you want to do, this is really important, is to make sure that you have a lap here where the first stripe here doesn't have a mate. So you have overlap over here and you have overlap over here. So what you don't want to do is line them up perfectly and just get a loop. You want to have a place to start, and this allows you to have a place to start cutting. So we just do this, and we're going to start to pin these together so that we form this continuous roll of bias. And when you line them up, you also want to remember that you're going to allow for a 1/4 inch seam, so you want them to be about a 1/4 inch. You want the two lines to match up. Just like that. It's a little bit fiddly, but after you've done it a few times, you'll get the hang of it. And I'm just going to pin each and every stripe just to make it really easy for myself.
Perfect. Beautiful.
You have it all pinned together, and you can see there's this extra little bit where it starts, but all the other stripes are aligned all along this edge. And now we're going to sew this at a 1/4 inch and press it open. Okay, so we've sewn that final seam and we've pressed it open, and you can see there's a little bit of a lap on each side. Now this is the real magic part. we get to cut in one continuous strip this huge length of bias tape from the small 12 by 12 square. So here we go. We just cut along the lines that we already drew. And that's really all you need to do. It's like magic! Pros and cons of making bias tape in the continuous bias method. The pros are that it's fast. It's a pretty quick way of doing it. It also feels kind of a little bit like a magic trick. And I just find it really satisfying to do that final cut and cut in that big spiral and have this long length of bias tape at the end. So I think those are the pros. The cons, it is a little bit fiddly. You do have to kind of line up those lines and make sure you get them, you know, not perfect, but pretty much perfect. And it is a little bit confusing if you haven't done it before because there's a lot of folding. And so a video like this will help you. You can come back and reference it. But the first time you do it, it might be a little confusing. So I would say that's the major con of doing the continuous method. All right, so Haley's gonna come in and she's gonna show you the other way.
So now I'm going to show you my method for cutting bias tape. And it's super easy, so it shouldn't take very long. The shade. So for this method, you're going to be primarily relying on your ruler, a clear ruler, an acrylic one preferably because it's a little bit easier to cut with a rotary cutter, which is your second tool. And then of course your cutting mat. You can do this with scissors and some chalk too. This just eliminates a step. So the first thing we want to do is we need to find the bias grain. So bias is a 45-degree angle. If your ruler is like mine, you'll have a little handy line that shows you that bias angle, and you can line that up with your selvage and then cut a line. If your ruler does not have that, you'll just want to find the inch increments and make sure that the selvage is just bisecting that right down the center. Make my first cut. All right. And then once I have that first line cut, then I can just cut in 1-inch strips. So I'm going to cut off a couple 1-inch strips here. All right. Next, what I want to do is I want to square up the edges of my bias strips. So again, utilizing the grid of my ruler, just going to trim off the ends. And what I like about this method is you can make as little bias tape as you want or as much as you want. So I have these 2 strips here, which would be totally enough to go around a neckline or something like that. And I just want to join them. So to join them, I am going to make a little 90-degree angle with my bias tape strips. I'm just going to pop a couple pins in there to hold them together. You can join bias just straight across, but this method is a lot less bulky. And then I will take some chalk and my ruler. So I am just connecting those corners, and that's going to be my guide as I sew. I think a common mistake that people make when they're doing this is they accidentally sew from the other corner. And if you're like really stressed about making that mistake, a good way to test is just to pin along the line you drew, and then you can see like so. That's what you want it to end up looking like. So I'm going to take this over to my sewing machine and I'm going to sew across from corner to corner. So now that that's sewn, that's what it looks like. And I went ahead and I pressed that seam open. And lastly, what we can do to reduce a little bit of bulk is just trim down the seam allowance here. All right, and that's it. You have your continuous piece of bias tape. So that is how I cut and join my bias tape. I really like this method because I find it to be just like really straightforward. When you're sewing, you're always like constantly kind of like juggling a lot of different thoughts and decisions. And I think that techniques like this that have a lot of or very little mental overhead save me just a little bit of time and mental space, which I appreciate. The drawback of this technique is that you definitely are a little bit less efficient with your use of fabric. So if you have a smaller scrap of fabric, this technique isn't necessarily the most efficient one to use, but it is good for making, smaller lengths of bias tape. So if you're just binding off, a couple armholes or a little neckline, then this is very easy for those short little lengths.
So now it's time for you to choose. So vote down below, which method is your favorite?
I was going on and on. Okay.
Okay, cutting bias tape 4.
Wait, what are we doing?
The outro.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Exercise your right foot.
Vote or die.